And what they And what they found is that the ideal ratio are three positives for every negative. Doctors John Gottman and Julie Gottman and their colleagues found that when working with couples, the ideal ratio are five positives for every negative. So let's stay with the three. And I want you to think about this for a minute. How many positives, two negatives, do you think your child hears in a day? An easier way to do it is to flip it and say, how many negatives for every positive does your child hear? I have to tell you that I hear numbers that are anywhere from 10 to 1 to 50 to 1. And that includes what kids are saying to themselves. So this celebration is an attempt to rebalance that. So we're doing a dance between cognitive behavioral interventions and relationship insight oriented building tools. Now, does this sound familiar to you? Monica, the mother of Lily, says, my 11-year-old daughter, Lily, recently started having emotional outbursts that turn into panic and anxiety attacks. It's clear she doesn't understand what's happening, gets scared, and has difficulty calming herself down. Charlie, father of Jericho, says it's hard when Jericho gets chippy. When his verbal provocations don't work, then he ratchets it up to physical behavior. There's no ownership. He's so convinced that it's all against him. He's punched walls, slammed doors, and broken things. What do kids say themselves? Joaquin, age 12, says, people get mad at me because I have a bad habit of backtalking. I want to know why before doing things and say my piece. What's the problem with that? There is one reason me and my dad get into fights. He's more, do it because I told you so. I'm the father, you're the son kind of deal. Callie, age 16, says, with my parents, it's like, stop nagging me. You're giving me such a hard time and making me feel like SH about myself. So I end up yelling at them to F off and leave me alone. Tyrone, age 14, says, not being able to focus when you want to. Really, I get distracted easily. People talking, one, looking at something, I would just daydream off into it. Like if I see it start snowing, I'll just look at the snow. Anything that catches my attention. And Layla, age 17, says, I haven't been succeeding at school and life, and I expect myself to succeed. I worry all the time about stuff. It's a constant state of my head being just above the water. So, who are neurodivergent children and teens? Now, we're talking about ADHD, but we know that ADHD rarely travels alone. So, neurodiversity is part of the human experience, just like racial diversity, socioeconomic differences, and gender diversity. And it refers to the wide range of natural differences among humans in terms of learning, attention, and emotion. Neurodivergent is a term that was coined by sociologist Judy Singer in the late 1990s. We know that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, and autism spectrum disorders are neurodevelopmental conditions that are affected by executive functioning challenges. And school is often the worst domain of functioning, where these differences and social issues are first noticed. These are kids who have more trouble in school and out of school than other kids do. They have a history of being labeled spacey, disorganized, lazy, or underachieving. They're also creative, spontaneous, funny, and warm. Over 50% of kids that are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders show signs of ADHD. But if your primary diagnosis as a child is ADHD, about 14% of those kids have level 1 autism. Sensory integration dysfunctions occur 10 to 20% of the time, and about 70% of kids with ADHD have a learning disability. Reading is math, and writing is the highest, somewhere around 65%. Um, you know, um, Kids are not really fond of the word disorder. And Layla, age 14, says, I feel like when people hear the word disorder, it makes them feel like they're not equal to people or they're different and they're not, excuse me, not Layla. I'm sorry. I read that wrong. Um, I'm sorry. I was trying not to sneeze. Lily, age 14, says, I feel like when people hear the word disorder, it makes them feel like they're not equal to people, or they're different from others, or you're sick and you're not. Your brain's just different. Disability. I don't like that word either. When I hear the word disability, I think you have an inability to do things, which isn't true. No matter what you have, no matter who you are, you can do things. Alex, age 12, says, I sit there for 15 minutes and not have a single thing on my paper because I'm thinking. And when the teacher says just write something, I can't get more than 3 words out. It's bad. So he's struggling to write because of his dyslexia, and then he's judging himself because he's struggling to write. Twice exceptionality are kids with high IQs in some areas, usually verbal processing or visual and spatial processing, and lower scores in working memory or processing speed. In fact, I recently talked to a woman, a mother whose son was just tested, and his verbal IQ was at 125, average is 100. His visual spatial was at 122. His working memory was at 97, and processing speed was at 87. He was diagnosed with ADHD. When we see those kinds of large differences, that tells us not only that there's ADHD, but there's twice exceptionality because there's an internal discongruence between high levels of understanding concepts and facts and lower levels of performance and recall. Julian, age 16, says, they are always telling me, why aren't you doing better in that class? You're gifted, behave like it. You should be acing that class. That, of course, does not make him feel very good. So let's get some facts about ADHD. So ADHD is a chronic condition marked by persistent inattention, hyperactivity, and sometimes impulsivity that is more frequent and severe than is typically observed in children of the same age. It's a novelty-seeking brain. Interest fosters motivation. These are creative, outside-the-box thinkers. ADHD is a performance-based condition that is related to executive functioning skill deficits. And of course, there are 3 types: hyperactive, impulsive, inattentive, and combination. ADHD affects about 11% of children and teens in the United States, and approximately 64% of kids between the ages of 4 and 17 have received an ADHD diagnosis at some point. About 5 to 10% of kids outgrow it, and we're not sure if they actually outgrow it or if they learn to live with it and cope more effectively, because the measures for assessing adult ADHD are not as robust as they are for kids. Approximately 55 to 75% of adults with ADHD have at least one child with ADHD. And if there's a child in a family with ADHD, there's about a 33% chance that a second child will have it. Parents raising kids with ADHD report considerably more stress than other parents do and can be more negative as well. And that in order to get the diagnosis of ADHD, there has to be clear evidence that in terms of that the symptoms are interfering with or reducing the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. Untreated ADHD often results in academic failure, peer rejection, poor social adjustment, and family problems. Interestingly, a lot of young people are getting their information on TikTok. Maybe you are too. I would really encourage you to stay away from a TikTok as your source of information about ADHD because a study was done that the top videos on ADHD, of those 52% were misleading and only 11% came from healthcare professionals. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the ADHD iceberg. So, the tip of the iceberg, which was first coined and depicted by Chris Ziegler Dendy, we see about 10%, so to speak, which represents the behaviors and symptoms that are characterized as being external. Meanwhile, the largest portion of the iceberg, the part we can't see, represents those hidden and symptoms and challenges that go unseen and are characterized as being internal. So let's say something about the iceberg we can see. These externalizing behaviors are frequently seen in the classroom, at home, or even in the workplace. They're easily observable and measurable, typically manifesting in distractibility, impulsivity, or hyperactivity. And they're related to the conscious executive functioning skills, what we call the hot skills, which I'll be talking about later, that have to do with impulse control, emotional control, organization, time management, initiation, etc. We see the tip of this iceberg, the external symptoms, in boys more than girls, in behaviors such as fidgeting, interrupting others, moving around the classroom, physical aggression, or talking too much, or being the class clown. The internal iceberg, these are characterized that as maybe being less observable to others, but they frequently rely on someone's self-report of their challenges. And these include a restless or wandering mind, low self-esteem. Of course, we see low self-esteem in the external symptoms, and it exists with the external symptoms. We may not see it, but we see it sort of like a dreamy quality, a spaced out quality, difficulty sustaining attention, trouble with shifting or flexibility, overwhelm, limited self-awareness, poor working memory. And with both types of ADHD, the tip of the iceberg and the hidden part, we see a great deal of shame. So let's launch the first poll. Can you launch that poll for me, please? I'd like to shift into a little bit of positivity here and ask you, what do you enjoy about kids with ADHD and neurodivergent? So just answer the first poll. Don't do the second one. What do you enjoy about being with kids with ADHD? For me, I love their sense of humor, their insight, their creativity, and of course, their sensitivity when we can do that. So if you can fill that out, that would be great. And I will rely on you, Amanda and Marion, to let me know when it's complete. So how do we determine if someone has ADHD? We want to understand the pattern of strengths and weaknesses in their executive functioning skills and how they are functioning in real time. So we're relying on the process of an assessment. And two critical skills that are needed to assess for ADHD, initiation and sustained attention, are not really accounted for in standardized testing, particularly in cognitive testing, because someone tells you to start and stop. But we are looking at a multitude of factors, and we want to assess for strengths and challenges to create a balanced approach to our interventions. For many parents, receiving and reading a psychological evaluation is very, very disturbing because they often focus on what's not working, on the problems. And so if you are involved in any kind of assessment, or you are a parent getting an assessment, you want to make sure that there's some focus on what your child can do well. So there are lots of different kinds of tools. I'll name some. For cognitive and academic assessment, we see the WISC, the WACE, the Woodcock-Johnson, or the Wyatt. There's visual motor processing, the Bender-Gestalt or the Ray. There are memory scales, the Delis-Kaplan, the reading challenges to assess for dyslexia, the CTOP or the Gray. And then there are ADHD and executive functioning rating scales, the BRIEF, the Brown ADD scales, the CBCL, the Vanderbilt, the Basque. And Doctors Russell Barkley and Peg Dawson and Richard Guare have a lot of their own forms that they prepare. And I also have a little measurement in my book called Rate Your Brain that could help you. I'm not a particularly a big fan of a continuous performance of tests because I think that they actually measure how well someone can, interact with a computer more than they interact with than their sense. Dr. Russell Barkley has said that he thinks that the WISC and the WACE and sometimes and the Woodcock-Johnson can be useful information about how a child thinks, but really the most important thing are things that are ecologically valid because they focus those rating scales because they focus on how executive functioning skills emerge or don't emerge in natural settings and capture a wider range of behavior. So we want to also really think about some diagnostic considerations for BIPOC populations. People of color have often had a history of discrimination, bias, inappropriate or inadequate evaluation and treatment. They've experienced mislabeling ADHD as low intelligence. There's often a belief in particularly communities among Black Americans that ADHD is overdiagnosed and overmedicated when actually the data shows underdiagnosis. Many people of color are reluctant to give their kids another label. If you are a clinician and you are here tonight, it's important to consider racial trauma, structural trauma in terms of systemic bias treatment and unequal access to care, poverty and discrimination, as well as how these affect school engagement. We also want to consider educational trauma. And so it's important that we consider any kind of observer bias. Children of color are more likely to be seen as problematic by school systems. There's also been studies about observer racism as well. So all of this discrimination affects someone's ability to assess for ADHD. Have the polls been completed?
Yes. So for the first question,
can you share the results?
Yeah, I definitely can.
Great. So here's what we see. Creativity is the main thing a lot of people enjoy about kids with ADHD. And the second thing is a sense of humor. And the third is intelligence and insight. Thank you very much for participating. So let's look a little bit at the brain. So take your hands, make two fists and put them like this. This is the size of your brain. And I know you're thinking, oh, my brain is bigger than this. Not really. This is roughly the size of your brain. It weighs about 3 pounds and has over 100 billion neurons. It reaches its full size and volume by the age of 10. It's an electrical system that's based on chemical reactions to communicate messages. And it develops from the back to the front and the inside out. There are 3 centers: the physiological center, our reptilian center right here. This is our cerebellum and brainstem, and they're responsible for breathing and heart rate and blood pressure. These are fully myelinated, connected when we're born. Then there's the middle of the brain, which is our emotional brain or our mammalian brain. And this is responsible for our it's where the amygdala lives, our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, how we process emotions. It's also the seat of memory because memory and emotional control are innately linked, and language. And then the front of our brain, right here, take your hand and do this and say, "Oi, what were you thinking? Well, my goodness, what were you thinking?" Because right behind here is our prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex is the human or the thinking brain. And this part of the brain figures out what is worth paying attention to and worth doing. And it really connects to and coalesces it around age 25 in neurotypical adults with about a 3-year delay in people with ADHD. And this affects self-awareness and judgment, which are the last executive functioning skills to fully mature. And we know that maturation is a very uneven process. Now, the adolescent brain is sharp in terms of its ability to learn. And around the age of 18, we could calculate that it's about 80% developed, connected. Um, as we age, we develop better and stronger connections between the regions of the brain from the back to the front. And the last region to fully connect is that prefrontal cortex. And the brain has a lot of plasticity. It changes and adapts. Um, and of course, during adolescence, we see sex hormones that stimulate the production of new neurons and facilitate pruning. Now, parts of the brain are a little bit have been found to be smaller in people with ADHD. For example, the corpus callosum, which is the superhighway of the brain that connects the left and right hemispheres, overall brain volume, and other organs. In a brain, we have a lot of neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters are like the ferries of the brain, right? And you probably have heard of serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine and acetylcholine. These neurotransmitters take messages from one neuron to another. And you can see in the slide right here, there's a synapse, right? I don't know if you can see that. And there's a little space. So here's one neuron and here's the other. Do you see my cursor? I don't know if you can see my cursor.
Yes, we can see your cursor.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. So right here is what we're interested in. So here, what happens is the message gets to the end of the synapse, to the end of the neuron, and it has to cross this river, and it needs a neurotransmitter ferry to pick it up. So in people with ADHD, there are not enough dopamine or norepinephrine neurotransmitters. There's either not enough to hang out in the synapse, or they rush in and get the message from one neuron and zip it back to the other without leaving it enough time to hang out in the middle, or they just never pick it up. So dopamine highlights what's important: rewards from activities, pleasure, and interest. ADHD brains have lower levels of dopamine, which makes it more difficult to work up excitement about something unappealing. Norepinephrine it activates areas of the brain involved in attention, concentration, behavioral control, and social judgment. Reduced norepinephrine affects those areas as well as sleep. Now, one of the things that's been studied in the United States, and according to the CDC, and despite findings from the longest study about ADHD, which is called the MTA study, um, that contrary to the findings that cognitive behavior therapy and medication produce the most effective long-lasting results, only 47% of kids with ADHD are receiving behavioral interventions. And that as kids age, the recommendations for those behavioral interventions go down, which is very unfortunate because medications are a catalyst. They help people retain information, practice it, and use the skills. This is why some people are so much in favor of making sure that younger kids actually have medication for ADHD so that they can learn what they need to learn, and then when they get to high school and college, they're more independent. Other parents don't like to medicate young children before they get through adolescence, and so they want to work on the behavioral interventions. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I do think when medication and behavioral interventions are both involved, the progress is more noticeable. Medications reduce the risk of later substance abuse, and because people don't need to self-medicate. So one of the benefits of medication is that it helps someone distinguish between who I really am and what my symptoms of ADHD are. And there are a lot of myths about medication that they're going to change your personality and they're dangerous and long lasting. Those have all been disproven. When we're talking about medication, here's something I want you to consider. The side effects to consider without medication are years of failure, frustration, underachievement, troubled relationships, social exclusion. So we want to ask, what is the risk of taking medication and what is the risk of not taking medication? Now, let's take a look at ADHD in boys. So boys relate more through shared activities, which makes uh, any difficulties they might have in verbal expression or reading social cues less important. And they experience fewer problems in an activity-oriented world because ADHD traits like risk-taking or, being the class clown or even a certain level of aggression can be viewed in a positive manner in terms of masculinity. Boys can be excluded because of increased aggression or calling too much attention to themselves or not sharing, pure concerns about fairness. And of course, inattentive boys are overlooked because their presentation is atypical and they're not drawing negative attention to themselves. Um, Dustin, age 16, says, my number one thing I hate about having ADHD is my being late everywhere. I'm bad with being on time. I'm really bad. I suck at thinking about how long things will take. The second thing I hate is that I lose everything. And when I say lose everything, I mean everything. In the past 4 years, I have lost over 30 water bottles, 4 or 5 lunch boxes, clothes at school, my iPad or my iPhone at least 8 times, which is a huge deal for me because I use it so much. I live around my phone. I love music, and I'm always listening to it. So let's meet Miguel and listen to his experience of living with ADHD. What are 3 things that you really like about yourself?
Oh, really like about myself that I'm different. That I'm different now. I'm just not the same as other people. I do not.
Sorry, I'm going to go back. I tried to raise the volume. I'm so sorry. Hold on. All right, I'm going to start again. We're going to start that again and pretend I didn't try to do anything. Okay. What are 3 things that you really like about yourself?
Oh, really like about myself that I'm different. That I'm different now. I'm just not the same as other people. I do not. I'm like, I think more strategically. I wouldn't say I'm smarter because everyone has the like thing. But I have a lot of cool fun facts that I know about the human mind.
So you like that you're different. What's another thing that you like?
The fact that helping people is at the top of my agenda. I love helping people.
And what's the third thing?
That I am much more interested in stuff that most people only get interested later in life, and that I know what I want and I know how to get it. Because most people are going for the stuff they really, really like. I want to have a life that I can be proud of and that other people can be proud of.
What are three things that frustrate you about yourself?
My focus, my hyperactivity, and how curly my hair can be. And how good I can be at chess and how bad I can be at chess.
What are three? Okay. Girls with ADHD have a much higher tendency for the internal traits of ADHD, the below the surface iceberg: forgetfulness, difficulty listening, problems with verbal expression and verbal control, misreading social cues. So maybe you see them as daydreaming, maybe they seem anxious or sad, and they're often referred to therapy for those things, and ADHD is not considered. Showing silliness, being shy or inattentive, trouble with friendships, picking at their nails or skin, or perfectionism. It's very hard for girls with ADHD because girls relate much more through verbal connection. That's how we sort of, can build relationships, whereas boys are much more prone to connect through activities. Girls with ADHD have been found to be sexually active earlier, and they're diagnosed later. Their signs of hyperactivity look different in girls. We can see excessive talking, not necessarily hyperactive physical behavior. They might be staring out a window, where a boy with external signs of ADHD will be tapping his foot and getting up and sharpening the pencil and interrupting repeatedly. And so they're not referred. So many girls with ADHD develop fewer friendships and experience more social rejection. Nona at age 10 says, "Sometimes I don't exactly hear all the stuff people say. I really don't hear it. Then I get in trouble because I miss something. I'll blank out on what people are saying, like if they're talking for a long time, maybe a minute. I'll be like, yeah, yeah." They're like, "What? I didn't ask a yes or no question. I didn't even ask you a question." And I forget things. That's very strange. I don't have the video. Okay. Well. Okay. So let's move on. Missing I'm missing a video, which I'm not sure what happened to it. So if I find it, I'll come back. Peer social challenges. So, what we see is about a third of kids with ADHD have social anxiety. Often they expect immediate responses from people and think, what are you doing that I'm not included in? What did I do wrong? They might attach a negative message to a pause or a silence. So we want to help them improve their social skills, how to listen and repeat back what you hear, how to look and describe what you see, how close do you stand to people. In our culture, it's about an arm's distance or 3 feet. Take out your measuring tape and show them how loud to be, how touchy to be. These are all things that need a direct instruction. What is negotiation? What is compromise? Some kids with ADHD are over-focused on social activities, including technology or social media. It's hard for them to be alone. They struggle with making positive friend choices. And who is a friend? What is a friend? These are things that are worth talking about. Also, there are many common family issues, and there are higher economic costs, according to one study, for raising kids with ADHD that can be as much as 5 times greater in terms of private tutoring, summer classes, computer software, replacing lost belongings and school supplies, dismissal from extracurricular activities, loss of daycare or something that's paid for by the parents. And in families that live with ADHD, there are impulse control issues all around, which is why using the 5 C's is so important. And of course, with adolescents, it's natural that they're going to be moving away from family bonds into society more at large. But they still rely on parents for safety, and this creates tension. It's kind of a push me, pull you relationship. And so what happens is that a lot of times for teens, the first response is no. because they need to think about it. Now, sometimes it's no because they just want to be contrary. And sometimes it's no because they want to be contrary and they want to think about it. And sometimes it's no as a pause so that they can think about it. So if you can say to your kid, you know what? No, okay, you can think about it and get back to me if you change your mind. That actually gives them a little bit of space and a little bit of perceived independence. Tyrone, age 19, says, I'm sure my mom is the reason why I'm in school because she noticed my ADHD first. She would make sure I was staying on top of my things and staying organized, even reminding me 1,000 times to do something. That's super helpful because my brain doesn't remember stuff. Sure, it gets hard. I'm sure my parents are mad at me a lot for doing things I don't mean to do, but they're super patient. It's always, okay, here's what you did. Let's improve it. So let's launch the second poll. What are your students, your children, your teens struggling with the most?
This was already answered at the same time, so I can share the results with you.
Sure. Okay, not that one. We need the next one. Okay, there we go. Okay, so 46% say managing screens appropriately, 45% dealing with anxiety, and 43% showing a lack of interest and low motivation. Okay, and very close by are doing homework and low self-esteem, navigating social relationships. All right, a lot of screens, anxiety, and lack of motivation. Got it. Thank you. Now, I said earlier that ADHD rarely travels alone, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So coexisting coexisting mental health conditions are common. In fact, one study showed that over 80%, almost the kids with over 80% of kids with ADHD have some kind of secondary diagnosis, whether it's a learning disability or a mental health issue or the things that we've already talked about. Now, anxiety is a coexisting condition about 34% of the time versus 9% in the general population. And when we say 34%, that's what somehow is recorded somewhere. I see that much more in my practice, and so do my colleagues. So usually what we see are sort of simple phobias and separation anxiety early on, and then general anxiety increases with age, and then around adolescence, we start to see the onset of social anxiety, except if children in elementary school are directly bullied. Often untreated anxiety can lead to depression. And with anxiety and depression, of course, we want to evaluate for victimization, bullying, or abuse. About 16 to 30% of kids have been diagnosed with depression. Again, these are what the statistics show. It's not necessarily what correlates to what we see in clinical life. Depression can occur as a result of being exposed to repeated social, emotional, or racial distress. And suicidality is twice as high in adolescents with ADHD, often masked as anger and seen in isolation. Research shows that eating disorders are almost 3.5 times more likely in girls with ADHD, particularly bulimia, which is about 5.5 times more likely. And we see substance abuse at about 10%, and about 10 to 17% of trauma-exposed kids meet the criteria for ADHD, and each worsens the other. People with ADHD who also have trauma are much more likely to score higher on what are called ACE assessments. And traumatic experiences, whether they're single incident, a chronic incident or complex, really rock people to their core. And what we see with people with ADHD is a kind of complexity of trauma, this thousand paper cuts of having a misdiagnosed ADHD or neurodivergence, educational, social, health, racism, homophobia, and poverty. All of these things that all teens are dealing with are exacerbated with kids with ADHD, because the daily experience of being told you're missing the mark, of being told not to do this or do that, or you're different, and this is demoralizing for kids over time, and it does result in a kind of trauma. Now, I do want to say something about how trauma is treated, which is that what we want to do is we want to rely on trauma-informed care. And this is something that parents can do as well, which shifts the focus from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you that you're acting this way. And that's a very important distinction, and one that will help your relationship with your kids a great deal. Now, we know that people, the kids with ADHD are set off more easily and experience more emotional flooding than their peers. And we see this in panic and irrational worry. Kids with ADHD struggle more than neurotypical peers with accessing and recalling things they know would help them in a given moment. And they live with a constant low level or overt level of worry about making another mistake, letting someone or themselves down, not being liked. So they work hard to avoid disappointment, but often their efforts are for naught. And it's common for all kids to experience a kind of anxiety seen in with worry and dread, and some nervousness in a new situation is expected. But what happens is usually these concerns go away once a child has mastered the tasks associated with a new situation. With kids who have anxiety diagnoses, these concerns do not go away. In fact, they get worse. And sometimes anxiety means that there really is showing us that a child or a teen or even an adult is being pushed into a situation where they don't have the internal skills to manage it. And so we need to teach them these skills. Anxious kids struggle with tolerating uncertainty. And so we want to teach them to be bored by their anxiety rather than frightened by it. They're really focused on what we call outcome certainty. They're preoccupied with a positive guaranteed outcome as a requirement for starting an action, or so I'm not going to try this unless I know it's going to work out for me. So when we're thinking about atypical anxiety, we want to ask, is this an age-appropriate response? Is the reaction out of proportion to the actual danger? And how often are these behaviors showing up? Do we need to consider help? And in which case, the answer would be yes. So how do we start to reduce anxiety? So one of the things that people do with kids who have anxiety is they try to reassure them. And reassuring doesn't work because it gives kids a short-term decrease in their worry, but a long-term increase because they're using you as a crutch versus learning how to intentionally talk to themselves in a way that helps them move forward bravely. So we want to maintain support of a child in the face of the most irritating, frustrating, and even scary behaviors that are reflections of their anxiety and how out of control they feel inside. Okay, that's why anxiety exists. So our job is to stay neutral and compassionate. So there's a difference between a worry that's a signal like, oh, I'm at the curb and I'm about to step off, and that car goes by really fast. The next time I'm at a curb, I'm going to be looking around to see if there's a car going by really fast. That makes sense. That's a signal versus noise. Oh my gosh, there are so many dangerous cars in the city. I can't go anywhere. I have to stay home all the time. That's noise. So what we want to help our young people say is something like, I'm willing to feel unsure. I'm willing to grab onto my courage and try this. What is the goal that you want? Okay. And we want to focus on not just, what is the worst case scenario, but best case scenarios. What could go right? So, one of the things that helps to say to kids who are anxious is, of course, you're not sure that you can handle this. It's natural to worry in that situation. Let's think about some resources that you have. Is there a past situation where you were concerned about something or worried? And how did you handle that? So instead of getting down on themselves, we want to basically use these two tools. One is focusing on the goal, and the other is reflective listening. What I heard you say is this. Did I get that right? Is there anything else? You telling me you're not sure you can do this. It's of course you're worried. Anyone would be worried. Let's think of a time when you were worried about something else, because the thing is, anxiety is a shapeshifter. So the different parts of how we respond to anxiety is what we want to look at, not the content. Social anxiety has really increased for neurodivergent students since the pandemic. It's a debilitating fear of judgment, humiliation, or rejection by others in social situations based on a belief of being fundamentally deficient. So these core beliefs related to social anxiety include, I'm going to embarrass myself, I'll make a bad impression, people won't like me, I'm not that smart. And so and then they'll engage in safety-seeking behaviors and also what I call mind reading, like that people who suffer from social anxiety believe they know what other people are thinking about them, which they don't. So what we want to do is name safety-seeking behaviors and what their function is, recall a social situation when somebody felt uncomfortable. How did they get through that? What part of them helped them get through that? And can we use that in this situation? And then we want to set small goals that challenge a fear and are doable. And I like to frame these as learning experiments. We're going to see what happens. It's okay to feel awkward. Feeling awkward is not going to do damage to you. Continuing to avoid situations and believing the negative self-talk will. So we're going to pause for questions or comments. I see that there are several questions. Let me see.
Thank you. Do you want me to read them out for you?
I cannot see them for some reason.
Okay,
Not opening.
perfect. I'll just read them out for you if that's okay.
Sure.
So the first one we have is, what advice or resources can you give a parent who has ADHD and their child who is also ADHD?
That's a really good question. So it's a very broad question. So I think I would say I would refer to the 5 C's: self-control, compassion, collaboration, consistency, and celebration. What resources are available? Not to be shamelessly self-promoting, but I would encourage you to look at my book or my website. And I have YouTube videos and I have a card deck. All of these things offer specific ways that you can apply my 5 C's in day-to-day life. One of the challenges for families living with ADHD is that you and your child may share symptoms of ADHD, or they may be different. In which case, can your strength support your child's challenge, and could your child's strength maybe help you with yours?
Perfect. Yes, I need that reminder on a regular basis. Thank you. Our next question is, can you comment on relational trauma relating to parent alienation?
I could comment on that. That is going to take a long answer.
Yes.
And I am aware of the time and how many more slides I want to get through. So if I have time, I'll come back to that question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Maybe we'll just do one more.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance supporting an adolescent with ADHD with executive functioning, such as reminding, and fostering their independence and accountability.
So reminders are like are really problematic in relationships with kids with ADHD, particularly with teenagers. Nobody wants to be a parental reminding machine, and no teenager wants to be reminded. So I like to reframe that as cueing. And the way that cues work is that you put tasks on a whiteboard in your kitchen, or you send a text, or you put a post-it somewhere. Kids with ADHD need visual cues. And so instead of you being the reminder machine, you can say, check the list, it's on the whiteboard, or check the list, it's on the, I texted it to you, rather than your child relying on you. Because when a child has to work their own way through a list, they're actually building independence. They're understanding sequencing, they're understanding organization and prioritizing. So I think it's really important to do that. Now, most kids will reject the list. Too bad, because my feeling is I don't want to remind you all the time. You don't want to be reminded. This is the option. We're going to do an experiment for 2 weeks and see if we argue less. That's the goal. Remembering that your child dislikes the arguments as much as you do. Kids will push up against you to create distance because they're adolescents. They're not sure where they end and where you begin. They need you, but they don't want to need you. And that's the task. The questions of adolescence are, who am I and where do I belong? And who am I and where do I belong? There's a dance between here at home with you and out with my friends. And so that's part of the challenge.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sharon.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. Thank you. So we know that kids with ADHD want to do well, but they struggle with how. And so what I want to say is that when kids expect failure, they've given up on themselves because the message that they've received along the way is that adults have given up on them, or adults can't help them, and adults don't understand them. And though all of those messages come together in, I'm unworthy, I'm unfixable. And that is what starts a fixed mindset. So we want to ask, what are some changes in the environment? What's happened to them, that trauma-informed care perspective? And to rely on compassion about what it's taking them to get through every day. What happens for a lot of kids with ADHD or kids who are neurodivergent is they hold it together at school well enough, and then they get home and they can't do it anymore. I had one client who would have horrible arguments with his mother. He was in 8th grade about doing homework after school. And he was like, no, I can't. His medication was wearing off. He's like, I can't do it. I want to wake up. I'd rather have you wake me up early, Mom. Give me my pill and I'll do my homework then. And she was rolling her eyes. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. And I said, hold up. We're going to do an experiment. Let's see. And sure enough, it worked. He got a booster to get him through the rest of the day at school because he was now taking his medication about an hour and a half earlier. And he got his homework done. He went to school. He came home. He was free and clear. Loved it. So it's about keeping our ideas about what's right and what should work open. The tyranny of the shoulds, as Aaron Beck says, throw them out the window. So we want to help kids understand the brain that they have and normalize it. We all have different types of brains. What do you call your brain? ADHD is a long and very scientific term that may mean nothing because no one's like, am I attention deficit? Like, what is that? So what we want to think about is, dreamy brain, foggy brain, race car brain, fast brain, music brain. I'm a doodler. I have an art brain. What type of brain? That helps. I, Sharon, have a worry brain. I know that about myself. Sometimes it helps me and sometimes it doesn't, but I know that that's where I'm going to go when I'm stressed. And nobody wants to have a disorder, and ADHD feels very far away. So we want to make sure that we talk about biology and genetic loading. And if you are a parent with ADHD, Talk about it. You know, I struggle too. Do one of the, do the rate your brain exercise from my book, or any of the parent-child exercises in the Dawson and Guare books, so that you can figure out what some of your executive strengths and challenges are, and what your kids are, and where, and the rest of the family, and how that kind of all comes together. When you share your own stories, when you help your kids find famous people, it reduces their narrative that there's something is seriously wrong with them that needs to be fixed. So I'd like you to meet Ananda and listen to her experience of living with ADHD. How did you find out that you had ADHD? And what does ADHD look like in your life in particular?
Mm-hmm. So, so I figured out that I had ADHD, or that it was a strong possibility that I had ADHD in high school, like sophomore, junior year, because I knew that I was like struggling my whole life with executive dysfunction, even though I didn't know that that's what it was called back then. But like I knew that that was something I was really struggling with, and that my parents were struggling with, like with me. And so like I decided, like I knew what ADHD was kind of, but I decided to look more into like the symptoms of it, and I realized a lot of them matched up. So I talked to my doctor, I sent out surveys and testing, and so that's how I got diagnosed. And then in my life, like ADHD affects me quite a bit, because it's like often like a constant struggle to like maintain like the things I need to do daily, and like manage my time and manage my space, and my mood. But I've gotten a lot better as I've gotten older at managing that.
Mm-hmm. In what ways do you think you've gotten better?
Well, one of them is obviously with the ADHD coaching that I got from you, and like helping me to like have like more like coping skills, and figuring out how to organize things and how to like organize my thoughts in a better way. Also, as I've gotten older, I've become better at like socializing and other skills like that I was never really that good at when I was younger. And that was obviously just through life experience, things like that.
So let's look at executive functioning skills. I mean, one of the things Ananda says in another video that I don't have time to show you is she says, people say that they have a lot on their plate. I have a lot on my plate too. It's just my plate is smaller. And I think that's a really great way to think about what it means to live with ADHD and executive functioning. That you have a lot on your plate. It's just your plate is smaller. So executive functioning skill is where it all comes together. And this is the command center of the brain. So it connects, prioritizes, and integrates cognitive functions moment by moment. And that includes emotional regulation. So it's, this part of the brain is like a series of conductors. If you think about it, it's like, let's say the Beatles are in the studio, and they're recording Abbey Road. And so you have, John, Paul, George, and Ringo and their instruments. And then in the booth, you have the various engineers, a vocal engineer for each of the people who are singing, an instrumental engineer for each of the musicians as well. So all of those engineers are like the executive functioning skills. They're working together to take the information from the studio and put it together into a melodious song. So executive functioning skills integrate memory with what we see and think about right now. They're responsible for self-regulation. When you're tired, when you're stressed, your weakest executive functioning skills are hit first. Everybody has executive functioning strengths and challenges. It's just that people with ADHD have significant executive functioning challenges that are more numerous than people who don't have ADHD, right? The more severe the executive functioning challenges are, the higher the likelihood there is of a learning disability. And I do want to say something about working memory. Working memory is an essential aspect of executive function. It's fundamentally linked to emotional control, to draw on past experiences and to relate to current situations. In order to improve working memory, we want to write things down. We want to really focus on single tasking, one thing at a time. And we want to use the rule of 3 with directions. So the way that works is I'm going to make eye contact with you. And if your child doesn't like eye contact, they can look here at your hair. And then you're going to state the direction. I want you to get your backpack. What was it that I want you to do? Then they're going to repeat it back to you, get my backpack. And then they're going to repeat it a second time. What do I want you to do again? Oh, Mom, get my backpack. Yes, because it's that second time that takes it and moves it down the memory line. So let's look at how we can improve some executive functioning skills. For emotional control, I want you to think about using the STAR method. We want to slow things down. And the STAR method is we're going to plan this in advance. So you always need to have you're going to predict and plan for triggers. So instead of wishing that they go away, instead what you're going to do is create a plan. And so what we're going to use a STAR method. You're going to call for a stop. Okay. When people are dysregulated, you're going to agree on how long that stop is and what people are going to do during that stop. One of my clients took her kids to the dollar store and made a calm me down box for each of them. That's what they did. Other clients, their kids like to go up to their room and listen to music. So one of my clients liked to get under her bed and read a story with a flashlight. One of them wanted to pet their cat, whatever it is. And for parents of younger children, sometimes they want to be with you, which is hard when you're pretty mad at them. Then you're going to come back for the think, which is to talk about, well, where do we go from here? Is there anything that you might, wish you'd done differently, or you'd like to do differently as we move forward? You might say something about that yourself. You're not giving instruction. You're just reflecting back what you hear, and you're deciding what the next right thing is, and then act. You're doing that next right thing. Recover is the time that you allow, which is several hours, for people to reset and move on beyond the incident. Then if you want to talk about the incident or think about something you were observing or a change that you'd like them to make, that happens after, when the body has settled. Now let's talk a little bit about motivation, which is linked to several executive functioning skills. Initiation, getting started, managing your time, doing things on time, correctly estimating how long it'll take, avoiding procrastination is related to both of those. Sustained attention, managing your attention and resisting distractions, organization and prioritizing what's most important to do, how am I going to go about doing it, and of course goal-oriented persistence, setting a goal, returning to it after an interruption, and metacognition, that's self-understanding, that's self-awareness, and focus. But everyone put your hand on your forehead and go like this. It's kind of goofy, but focus is a dynamic process of choosing what is critical to notice or do. It's the spotlight of your attention. And you improve focus by noticing where it is. Most kids notice when they return from what I call from the drift. They go to, the favorite pizza parlor during a boring talk in social studies, and they come back when someone calls their name and they don't know what to do or what to say. So we want to teach our kids how to cope when they return from a drift. In terms of motivating kids to do the tough stuff, we want to remember that interest stimulates motivation. And there's extrinsic motivation, which is an outside request that achieves, depends. You have to do this responsibility to get a goal. You turn in your permission form for the field trip by Friday so you can go on Monday. And then there's intrinsic motivation, which means striving for a goal for personal satisfaction. You want to run 3 miles instead of incentive too. You want to make the next level on a computer game. When a task is fundamentally unrewarding or uninteresting, there is naturally less dopamine associated with doing the dishes, taking the trash out. It's going to take these kids twice as long to do it because they already have lower amounts of dopamine in their brain. So it's like a double deficit. This is why we want to put the have tos before the want tos. So that means identifying incentives that matter. So how do we, excuse me, I'm so sorry. How do we identify incentives? We want to look at something that matters to them, and then we're going to set that up. So what are some strategies for improving initiation? So we're going to, work with their own desire to master things, break things down into small, doable chunks, micro steps, check in with their progress, not necessarily nagging, and use pinch, which I use as play, interest, novelty, cooperation that results in happiness. So we're going to gamify things, make them fun, interesting, change things around so they're new, work with our kids. Procrastination can be debilitating, and there are different kinds: perfectionistic, avoidant, and productive. Productive is when you do something else that needs to be accomplished that's easier than the main task. So that productive procrastinators who are kids might have the sharpest pencils, or they'll arrange their desks, so they'll pick the perfect song to listen to. So they're getting stuff done, but not the stuff that needs to get done. So when we identify the type of procrastinator, then we can help our kids reduce that type of procrastination. And really the best way for reducing procrastination, regardless of the type, are these 5 steps here. Improving time management. The ADHD brain is a now, not now brain. It's hard to estimate time because kids don't feel it. So this means using an analog clock and teaching them how to read it, practice planning time, use backwards design. You have to be at school by 8. It takes you 20 minutes to eat breakfast. Now that's at 7:40. It takes you 15 minutes to get dressed. That's 7:25. Then you need another 10 minutes just to gather up all your stuff. That's 7:15. Let's say you wake up at 6:45 because you throw a couple more things in there. Time is super teachable. Organization and prioritizing. These go together. So to improve organization, you want to make ordered lists to guide kids through the day and their responsibilities. And then you refer to the list, as I was talking about before. And you give these kids extra time for organizing materials and what makes sense to them in terms of organizing. Is it color? Is it alphabetical? A numerical? So we want to work with them. And then we want to think about prioritizing. Most kids with ADHD can do a brain dump, but they can't order things. Everything seems important. So we want to set up a strategy based on the Eisenhower matrix. What's urgent, which is time related, and what's important, which is a value. And help them come up with a list that includes deadlines, etc., and prepare to teach these skills repeatedly. In terms of improving sustained attention and goal-directed persistence, we want to set realistic timed work periods. How long can your child actually concentrate for? And then take a timed break, and then another period, and then another timed break. Think about the order of work. If I don't know about you, but maybe do you like to do something easy and get warmed up and then do something hard and then reward yourself with something medium? What's easy? What's hard? What's medium? These are conversations that we want to have with our kids. And then collaborate on your goals to make them within reach instead of, lofty goals that kids can't do. And if your child is not meeting the goal that you want them to set, then that goal is still too hard. So one of the things we want to do when we're thinking about working with kids and setting up incentives and making changes in behaviors is choosing one thing to work on, because people can really only change one thing at a time. My husband will say, I want you to turn off the light when you come inside. I want you to stop putting your briefcase on the kitchen counter. And I also don't want you to interrupt me. I don't like that. And I'll say, which one do you want? And of course, he says, the interrupting, which is the hardest one. One thing. Am I still working on that? Of course. And then one thing that they enjoy, so that their work, the task that they don't want to do comes first. You do your homework first, and then you earn your screen time. How do we build metacognition? We ask questions. We ask questions. How am I doing? What's helped me before that could apply to this situation? What's working? What's not working? And what are some cues that are around me to help me make a positive choice? I do want to say a few words about dealing with lying and pushback. And particularly for adolescents, the teen brain and gratification can lead to saying and doing things that you regret. Of course, this happens for younger children too. And so instead of dealing with the guilt or shame directly, kids might make up excuses or deny their actions, hoping you'll believe what they say. It's a kind of magical thinking. So we want to be a lie detective. Honesty is consistent. Lies shift and change. Rehearsed stories are usually false. Set up consequences in advance. Just like we plan for emotional and behavioral upsets, we're going to plan for lying and pushback, and create an agreement that has fair and logical consequences. If you do this, then you may not earn that, and then encourage accountability. And what that means in real time. You can call me to pick you up at midnight anytime with no questions asked at that moment, and then you do that. And then you talk about what real apologies look like. What does it mean to make amends? Set that up in whatever system you create. And of course, practice honesty yourself. It's important to remember that pushback and oppositional behavior can mask other emotions, such as anxiety, depression, bullying, exclusion. And kids act out when they have these feelings that they don't know how to articulate or they're ashamed of. So let's talk a little bit about shame, because we want to say a few things about shame. You'll see in your slide handouts that there's a thing on using screen solutions. I encourage you to look at that as a way to help you set up screens as a reward. But a lot of kids with ADHD have a deep-seated sense of shame about being different. So there's a difference between guilt, I did something bad, but I'm still a good person, and shame, I did something, quote, bad. I'm saying bad in quotes. I did something I regret, I'm a bad person, that's guilt. Shame is I did something I regret and I'm a bad person. So sometimes the shame is obvious, sometimes it's more hidden. And for a lot of kids with ADHD, they see asking for help as a failure, where we see it as, why don't you ask me for help? They see it as a failure. So what we want to do is build resilience, build a growth mindset. So a growth mindset means that somebody believes that they can get smarter through hard work and effective strategies, that they bounce back with resilience when problems arise, asking, what could I do differently? So we want to help kids focus on finding their strengths, identifying their talents, fertilizing them and growing them. We want to help kids identify charismatic adults, people who believe in them, people they feel safe with. And then we want to remind children that people are supposed to stumble, right? That's what resilience is about. I'm living and I'm learning. That's a growth mindset. Resilience is I'm bouncing, I'm back, I'm starting the process of change, and I'm going to keep going, even if it's a struggle. So key takeaways from today. Lean into their strengths. Remember that they're sensitive about their challenges. Recall, believe that scaffolding is not about excuses. It's about facilitating and making adjustments for executive functioning weaknesses. Identify what they can do and what is possible. That's the next step, not 3 steps above. Do more of what works and slowly focus on one area of improvement. Ignore pushback and put on your Teflon suit. Certainly set limits about the types of language that is okay or unacceptable. Make agreements about what's going to happen when this happens. You talk back to me, then you're not going to earn this thing that you want. And if you don't talk back, you will earn this thing that you want. Remember that tweens and teens are negotiating for power as they forge their own identity. They're interested in the process of problem solving, not just the solution. Janice, age 18, says, when I was younger in 9th grade, I didn't want any help. I wanted to deal with things on my own. I was a cocky kid. But now I know that even though you're independent, you need help sometimes. You can't always do it alone. So I hope you'll stay connected with me. Please scan this QR code for a handout on managing inappropriate behavior in kids with ADHD. I know that the folks at Pine River will be sharing this with you along with the handouts that I've sent to them. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to keep this up for a little bit and I look forward to some questions.